We all know Chuck Berry as one of the greatest pioneers of rock. But what about his dark side? Does knowing too much about a rock star's personal life ruin their music for you? Does knowing more cause you to enjoy their work less? I know it can be hard to separate the artist from his work. And I know this video might upset some people, but I promise I'll approach the conversation with the sensitivity it deserves. I think it's important that when you're looking back at someone's life, it's only fair that you examine the times in which they lived in order to find some context and a fuller understanding of what was going on around them. So, having said that, let's first try to get an idea of where Chuck came from. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1926 into a middle-class African-American family and was the third of 6 children. His parents were both grandchildren of slaves. His mother was a school teacher and principal. His father worked as a carpenter and contractor and was a deacon in the church. But his father was also a gambler. His gambling addiction often caused financial instability for the family. Chuck wrote in his autobiography that he was embarrassed by his father's gambling and how it affected the family. But in spite of that, Chuck claimed he loved his father dearly and gave him credit for supporting his early musical career. Life was a mixed bag for middle-class African-American families in St. Louis during the 1930s and 40s, and no doubt the same for Chuck and his family. While they were starting to enjoy some financial stability and opportunities for upward mobility, they were also facing significant barriers and discrimination due to the racial attitudes of the time. Like many parts of America, Missouri had enacted segregationist laws and policies that systematically disenfranchised the African-American population, making it difficult, if not impossible, for them to have an equal voice in the political process. As a result, it's understandable how a young man growing up in such circumstances could develop deep feelings of resentment and perceive the system to be biased against him. These experiences may have influenced Chuck's self-perception and outlook on the world. In high school, Chuck had his first run-in with the law. In 1944, when he was 17 years old, he and 2 friends made their way to Kansas City, where they were arrested and charged with a series of armed robberies and car theft. Chuck claimed at the time that he was wrongly accused and maintained his innocence, saying he was only a passenger in the car with acquaintances who had committed the robbery without his knowledge. At the trial, Chuck was represented by a court-appointed attorney, and he decided to plead guilty to the charges, hoping to receive a lighter sentence. But in the end, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which he began serving at the Intermediate Reformatory for Young Men in Algoa, Missouri. He served almost 3 years there and was released on his 21st birthday in 1947. Shortly after his release, he married Themetta Suggs, and they settled into domestic life. They started a family, and Chuck worked as a janitor, studied for his cosmetology license, and helped his father with his carpentry work. He played his guitar around town, working in local nightclubs, and started to make a name for himself. All the pieces finally fell into place in 1955, when his recording career took off with the release of his record, Maybelline. Things were going well, and by the late 50s, Chuck was an established star with several hit records, film and television appearances, and a profitable touring schedule. In 1962, however, his career was derailed when he stood trial and was convicted of violating the Mann Act for transporting an underage girl across state lines for immoral purposes, a charge that he would continue to deny throughout his life. The charges stemmed from a series of incidents that began in December of 1959, following a concert appearance in El Paso, Texas. In the early morning hours, Berry and his band crossed the border into neighboring Juarez, Mexico, where he met a 14-year-old Native American waitress, Janice Escalante. According to the prosecution's case, Berry took Escalante on tour with him across several states, repeatedly had sex with her, and had brought her back to Missouri to work at his nightclub. 2 weeks after arriving in St. Louis, he fired her and tried to put her on a bus back to Texas. In retaliation, she ended up going to the police to file charges. It emerged that Escalante had been working as a prostitute, and Berry insisted she was anything but innocent. But the fact remained she was just a child. The case went to trial in 1960, and after a very messy, racially charged process that portrayed Berry as a sexual predator, he was eventually found guilty by an all-white jury. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and fined $5,000. Chuck unsuccessfully appealed the decision, and he began serving his term in February of 1962. The case was highly publicized and had a significant impact on his career. He was obviously unable to tour or record new music while he was in prison, but he did manage to write a few songs. He was released at the end of '63 after serving just 20 months of his sentence. It's been said that after his release, Chuck was never quite the same. He said he felt hounded by the press and betrayed by both sides of the legal profession. Maybe he had been. Or maybe Chuck was just a self-centered, manipulative narcissist. Fast forward to 1979. Just 3 days after being honored at the White House by President Jimmy Carter, Chuck was found guilty of tax evasion. The IRS had been investigating him for 5 years and accused him of being a chronic tax evader. The charges stemmed from 3 separate indictments issued in 1973. The IRS accused him of not reporting his cash earnings and making under-the-table deals with promoters. Chuck had a thing about always being paid in cash for his concert appearances. You see, he had been burned before. Chuck always had it written into his contract that he was to be paid his entire fee in cash before he would perform. It might have been smart business on Chuck's part at the time, but it certainly led to some sloppy record-keeping and the potential for creative accounting come tax time. Whether Chuck intentionally lied about his income or he was just sloppy about keeping track, as far as the IRS was concerned, it didn't really matter. He pleaded guilty to the charge that in 1973, he failed to pay nearly $110,000 in income taxes. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and 1,000 hours of community service. In 1987, Chuck was arrested yet again, this time in New York City. A woman he was dating claimed he belted her in the mouth at about 1 a.m. at the Gramercy Park Hotel, causing lacerations requiring 5 stitches to repair, 2 loose teeth, and facial contusions. He eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of harassment and was fined $250. Once again, Chuck got off easy. For being a happily married man, he sure had more than his share of difficult relationships with other women. That brings us to perhaps the most bizarre and salacious accusations yet. In 1988, Chuck had purchased the Southern Air restaurant in Wentzville, not far from his home just northwest of St. Louis. According to the Los Angeles Times, a female employee claimed in 1990 that Barry installed hidden cameras at both the restaurant and at his estate, Barry Park, to videotape and photograph women undressing or using the toilet. A handyman, who just so happened to be the husband of the employee making the allegations, discovered a box of VHS tapes containing incriminating material, tapes of women using the restroom facilities, photographed from several different cameras, and edited into compilation videos. Girls, who were obviously under 18 years of age, were among the hundreds of people videotaped. Formal criminal charges were never brought, and Barry never went to trial for his activities, but he was the subject of a class action lawsuit. He eventually settled for $1.2 million, which was divided among 59 different accusers. After the suit was settled, Chuck had the audacity to file his own lawsuit to have the videotapes returned to him. The Southern Air restaurant went out of business and fell into a state of disrepair, never to reopen. Chuck finally sold the property to Lindenwood University in 1999. At about the same time, Chuck was the focus of a big federal narcotics bust. His estate in Wentzville was raided by federal investigators who claimed they had long suspected him of smuggling cocaine around the country, allegedly in his guitar case. Remember, cocaine and crack use was quite prevalent in many communities around this time. America was at the height of its war on drugs, and the federal government was making a big show of trying to curb the flow of narcotics into these communities. Maybe the feds saw Chuck as a convenient target, or maybe someone gave them some bad information. But whatever the case, they thought they had something on Chuck, and they were intent on taking him down. As it turned out, Chuck had been falsely accused. There was absolutely no evidence of cocaine found at his home, although they did find some pot and hashish, a few guns, and more than $120,000 in cash lying around. But here's the kicker. What they did find was a huge stockpile of pornography, much of it homemade. Dozens, if not hundreds of books, VHS tapes, photos, and slides of women, some depicting young girls under 18. And some of it included some pretty kinky stuff, what we might euphemistically call bathroom play, between Chuck and various women. It seems like Chuck was into some pretty weird and distasteful stuff. But hey, what happens behind closed doors between consenting adults is really none of our business, right? Chuck ended up being charged with only misdemeanor marijuana possession along with 3 charges of child abuse due to the underage porn. Apparently, he had some pretty good lawyers as they were able to strike a plea deal. The sex offense charges were dismissed entirely, and he was sentenced to just 2 years probation on the drug charges. When a rock star dies, we're left to come to terms with what can often be a complicated, controversial legacy. Can we ever separate the art from the artist who created it? How should we react when the skeletons long hidden in the closet are finally revealed and exposed to the light of day? We struggle with the ethics of celebrating artistic achievements while condemning the vile acts of the deeply flawed, if not downright despicable people who created that art. In the case of Chuck Berry, his influence on popular music is so strong that to ignore what he created would mean to deny that rock and roll even exists. So what do? Are we compromising our morality when we bop along to Sweet Little 16 on the radio now that we know that Chuck had a kink for young girls? I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I'll admit, when I listen to that song now, I hear it in a completely different way, and it makes me feel just a little bit creepy. So, what do you think? Do we still celebrate Chuck Berry as a rock and roll hero? Or do we instead think of him as a misogynistic philanderer who was all too willing to take advantage of people for his own selfish gratification? Can both be true at the same time? Or are we compelled to make a binary choice? Let me know what you think. And I hope you'll keep an eye out for our next video here on Dead Rockstar.